Maya Rodriguez had always believed that love meant sacrifice, even when that sacrifice left bruises hidden beneath long sleeves and makeup carefully applied each morning. For 3 years, she had lived with Derek Thompson in their cramped Phoenix apartment, telling herself that his explosive temper was just stress from his construction job, that his controlling behavior was protection, that the escalating violence was somehow her fault. The turning point came on a scorching Tuesday evening in July when Derek discovered she had been secretly saving money from her part-time grocery store job. The $20 bills she had carefully tucked away in an old jewelry box represented her desperate hope for freedom, her ticket to somewhere safe. When Derek found the money, his rage erupted like a desert storm. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her violently while screaming accusations about her planning to leave him. Maya felt something inside her finally break, not from fear this time, but from a sudden, crystal-clear realization that she deserved better than this life of walking on eggshells and hiding her pain. That night, while Derek passed out drunk on the couch after his rampage, Maya made her choice. She gathered only the essentials, her identification documents, the remaining money he hadn't found, a water bottle, and the worn hiking boots her grandmother had given her years ago. She knew Derek would wake up angry and hunt for her, checking with her few remaining friends and family members first. Her only chance was to disappear completely, to go somewhere he would never think to look. Maya had grown up hearing stories from her grandmother about the vast Sonoran desert that stretched beyond Phoenix, tales of ancient paths and hidden springs known only to those who understood the land's secrets. Her grandmother, who had Apache ancestry, had often spoken of the desert not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a refuge for those who approached it with respect and humility. As Maya slipped out of the apartment before dawn, she made an impulsive decision that would either save her life or end it. She would head into the desert. The first day of walking was brutal. The July heat rose from the desert floor in shimmering waves, and Maya quickly realized how unprepared she was for this journey. Her single water bottle was nearly empty by noon, and her feet were already blistering inside her hiking boots. But every step away from the city felt like a step toward freedom, and the thought of Derek's hands on her again gave her strength to keep moving. She followed old mining roads at first, then deer trails, always heading deeper into the wilderness where cell phone towers couldn't reach and where Derek's truck couldn't follow. By the second day, Maya was in serious trouble. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her skin burned despite her attempts to stay in shade, and she was rationing her remaining drops of water with increasing desperation. She had seen no other humans since leaving the outskirts of Phoenix, and the reality of her situation was becoming terrifyingly clear. She might have escaped Derek's fists only to die alone in the desert that her grandmother had painted as sanctuary. As the sun reached its merciless peak on her third day, Maya collapsed under a scraggly mesquite tree, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Through her heat-exhausted delirium, Maya heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. She forced her swollen eyes open, expecting to see a mirage or perhaps Derek having somehow tracked her down. Instead, she found herself looking up at a man who seemed to have materialized from the desert itself. He was Native American, probably in his 40s, with weathered hands and eyes that held both kindness and ancient wisdom. His name was James Crow Feather, and he moved through the harsh landscape as if it were his living room. James had been tracking an injured deer when he spotted Maya's erratic footprints crossing an old Apache trail. He was a traditional tracker, one of the few left who still knew the old ways of reading the desert's subtle messages. The meandering pattern of her steps, the places where she had stumbled, the way she had chosen shade over direction, all of this told him a story of someone fleeing in desperation rather than wandering for pleasure. When he found her semi-conscious under the mesquite, he immediately recognized the signs of severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. James knelt beside Maya and gently lifted her head, offering small sips from his water bottle while speaking to her in a calm, steady voice. He had seen the fatting bruises on her arms and the fear that flickered in her eyes even in her weakened state. He didn't need to hear her story to understand that she was running from something worse than the desert's dangers. His grandmother had taught him that the desert sometimes sent people who needed help, and it was his responsibility to answer that call. Maya tried to speak, to explain herself, but James simply shook his head and helped her drink more water. He told her in his quiet way that explanations could wait until she was stronger, that right now the most important thing was getting her to safety. He had a camp about 5 miles away, near a natural spring that few people knew about. But Maya was too weak to walk that distance, and the afternoon heat was still building toward its daily crescendo. James made a decision that drew on both his physical strength and his cultural knowledge. He would carry Maya to safety, but not by the direct route that would expose them both to the killing heat. Instead, he would take her through Bright Angel Canyon, a hidden passage that his people had used for generations to travel safely through this part of the desert. The canyon offered shade, occasional water sources, and most importantly, a route that would be impossible for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain to follow. Lifting Maya onto his back, James began the careful descent into the canyon. The walls rose around them like protective arms, blocking out the worst of the sun's assault. Maya drifted in and out of consciousness as they traveled, but she was dimly aware of James's sure-footed progress over loose rock and around hidden obstacles. He moved with the confidence of someone who had learned these paths as a child, stopping occasionally to point out pictographs left by his ancestors, or to offer her more water from springs that bubbled up from the canyon floor. Hours passed as they made their way through the winding passage. James maintaining a steady pace despite carrying Maya's full weight. The natural spring where James had made his temporary camp was like an oasis from a dream. Clear water bubbled up from underground sources, creating a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees and wild grass. Maya had never seen anything so beautiful in her life, and she wept with relief as James gently set her down in the shade. He helped her drink slowly and steadily, warning her about the dangers of drinking too much too quickly after severe dehydration. Over the next 2 days, James nursed Maya back to health with the patience of someone who understood that healing took time. He made shelter for her using traditional techniques, weaving together branches and desert plants to create a structure that stayed cool even during the hottest part of the day. He showed her which desert plants were safe to eat, how to find water by reading the landscape, and most importantly, how to move through the desert without leaving obvious tracks. Maya gradually opened up about her situation, telling James about Derek's escalating violence and her desperate escape. James listened without judgment, sharing his own wisdom about survival and the strength that could be found in the desert's teachings. He explained that his grandmother had always said the desert tested people. Those who approached it with respect and humility would find refuge, while those who came with arrogance or evil intentions would be turned away or worse. On the third morning, James told Maya that they needed to discuss her next steps. She couldn't stay at the spring indefinitely, and she needed a plan that would keep her safe from Derek while allowing her to rebuild her life. James had contacts in several cities, people who worked with women escaping domestic violence, and he could help her reach them safely. But first, he wanted to teach her something that might save her life if she ever found herself in danger again. James spent the morning showing Maya advanced desert survival techniques, how to navigate by reading the stars and the sun's position, how to find water in seemingly barren landscapes, how to move silently and leave minimal traces. These were skills his people had developed over centuries, knowledge that had helped them survive in harsh conditions when others perished. He told her that this knowledge was now hers to keep, a gift that no one could take away from her. As they prepared to leave the spring, Maya felt a transformation within herself that went far beyond physical recovery. The woman who had fled Phoenix in terror was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that she possessed strength she never knew existed. James had shown her that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about adapting, learning, and finding power in unexpected places. The journey out of the canyon was easier than the trip in, partly because Maya was stronger, but mostly because she now moved with purpose rather than desperation. James taught her to read the desert's moods, pointing out signs of weather changes and showing her how different animals moved through the landscape. By the time they reached the edge of the wilderness, Maya felt like she had received an education that few people ever had the chance to experience. James had arranged for Maya to meet with Elena Martinez, a counselor who ran a safe house in Tucson specifically for women escaping domestic violence. Elena was waiting at a designated meeting point near a small desert town, her truck loaded with supplies and her calm demeanor immediately putting Maya at ease. The two women connected instantly, and Maya felt the first stirrings of hope about her future as Elena explained the services available to help her rebuild her life. Before leaving Maya with Elena, James took her aside for one final conversation. He pressed a small leather pouch into her hands, explaining that it contained desert sage and a piece of turquoise from the spring where she had recovered. He told her that these would remind her of her strength whenever she felt afraid or uncertain. More importantly, he gave her his contact information and made her promise to reach out if she ever needed help or guidance. Elena drove Maya to the safe house in Tucson, where she was introduced to other women who had survived similar situations. For the first time in years, Maya found herself surrounded by people who understood her experience without needing detailed explanations. The safe house provided counseling, legal assistance, and most importantly, time and space to heal from the trauma she had endured. During her first week at the safe house, Maya learned that Derek had indeed reported her missing to the police, painting himself as a concerned boyfriend worried about his girlfriend's mental health. He had convinced some people that Maya was unstable and potentially suicidal, a manipulation tactic that made Maya grateful for her decision to disappear completely, rather than staying with friends or family where he might have found her. Working with the counselors at the safe house, Maya began to understand the patterns of abuse she had endured and how Derek's behavior had gradually isolated her from support systems and eroded her self-confidence. She learned about the cycle of violence, the psychology of abusers, and most importantly, strategies for building a new life free from fear and control. Maya also received practical assistance with finding employment and housing. Elena connected her with job training programs and helped her apply for positions that could provide financial independence. The safe house had relationships with sympathetic employers who understood the challenges faced by women escaping domestic violence and were willing to provide flexible working arrangements during the transition period. 3 weeks after arriving at the safe house, Maya received her first paycheck from a new job at a nonprofit organization that provided services to other trauma survivors. The work felt meaningful in a way that her previous job never had, and she found herself drawing on her own experiences to help others navigate their healing journeys. For the first time since leaving Derek, Maya began to envision a future that extended beyond mere survival to include genuine happiness and purpose. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Maya was discovering who she really was when not filtered through someone else's expectations and demands. 6 months later, Maya had her own small apartment in Tucson and was working full-time as a victim advocate. Her life had structure and safety, two things she had never fully appreciated until they were absent. She maintained regular contact with James, who had become not just her rescuer but a trusted friend and mentor. He would sometimes visit the city, and they would have dinner together, sharing stories about their respective work and the people they were helping. During one of these visits, James brought news that both troubled and empowered Maya. Through his network of contacts, he had learned that Derek was facing charges for assaulting his new girlfriend. The woman had pressed charges and was receiving support from law enforcement, something Maya had never felt strong enough to do. James told her that if she ever wanted to add her own testimony to the case, Alina and the legal advocates at the safe house would help her navigate that process. Maya spent weeks wrestling with the decision. Part of her wanted to leave the past buried and focus on her new life. But another part recognized that speaking up might prevent Derek from hurting other women in the future. She discussed the situation extensively with her counselor and with other survivors who had faced similar choices. Eventually, she decided to provide a victim impact statement detailing her own experiences with Derek's violence. The process of preparing her statement was emotionally challenging, but ultimately healing. Maya worked with a victim advocate to document the pattern of abuse she had endured, the escalation of violence, and the impact Derek's behavior had on her life. Writing down these experiences in official language somehow made them feel more real and less like shameful secrets she needed to hide. When the time came to submit her statement, Maya felt nervous but determined. She knew that her words might not change the outcome of Derek's case, but they would be part of an official record acknowledging what had happened to her. For someone who had spent years having her reality denied and minimized, this legal recognition felt profoundly important. Derek ultimately pleaded guilty to assault charges and was sentenced to jail time plus mandatory anger management classes. Maya felt no satisfaction in his punishment. She had moved far beyond wanting revenge. Instead, she felt relief that his pattern of behavior was finally being addressed by the legal system, and that his current girlfriend would have support and resources that Maya had lacked during her own ordeal. The experience of participating in Derek's legal case also sparked Maya's interest in policy advocacy. She began volunteering with organizations that work to improve legal protections for domestic violence survivors and to educate law enforcement about the dynamics of abusive relationships. Her combination of personal experience and professional training made her an effective advocate, and she found herself speaking at conferences and training sessions throughout Arizona. Maya's work caught the attention of state legislators who were drafting new domestic violence legislation, and she was invited to provide input on proposed changes to protective order procedures and victim services funding. A year and a half after her desert rescue, Maya received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during her darkest days with Derek. She had been selected to receive a Courage Award from a statewide coalition of domestic violence service providers, recognizing both her survival and her subsequent advocacy work. The ceremony would be held in Phoenix, the city she had fled in desperation, and Maya felt both honored and nervous about returning to the place where her nightmare had begun. James offered to accompany her to the ceremony, understanding that returning to Phoenix might trigger difficult memories. Maya accepted his offer gratefully, knowing that his presence would provide both practical support and a tangible reminder of how far she had traveled from that terrified woman he had found in the desert. Elena also planned to attend, bringing several other women from the safe house who drew inspiration from Maya's transformation. The night before the ceremony, Maya couldn't sleep. She found herself thinking about all the women who were still trapped in situations like the one she had escaped, women who might not have access to the resources and support that had saved her life. She thought about the role that chance had played in her survival. If James hadn't been tracking that injured deer, if he hadn't known about the hidden spring, if Alina hadn't been available to help with her transition to safety. At the ceremony, Maya was surprised by the size of the audience and the number of organizations represented. Her acceptance speech focused not on her own courage, but on the network of support that had made her survival and recovery possible. She spoke about James's wisdom and generosity, Alina's professional expertise and personal compassion, and the other survivors who had shared their stories and strategies for healing. Maya also used her platform to advocate for increased funding for rural domestic violence services, noting that many women in isolated areas lacked access to the resources that had been crucial to her own escape and recovery. She challenged the audience to think about creative partnerships between traditional service providers and community members who might have unique knowledge and skills to offer survivors in crisis. After the ceremony, several people approached Maya with their own stories or to ask for advice about helping others in similar situations. A young woman named Lisa Thompson pulled her aside and whispered that she was currently living with an abusive partner and didn't know how to leave safely. Maya spent an hour with Lisa, providing practical information about safety planning and connecting her with local resources, including Alina's safe house. That conversation reminded Maya why her advocacy work felt so important. Behind every statistic about domestic violence was a real person struggling with fear, isolation, and limited options. Maya's visibility as a survivor who had not only escaped, but thrived gave other women permission to imagine different futures for themselves. The weekend in Phoenix also gave Maya an opportunity to visit some of the places that had been significant during her relationship with Derek, but now from a position of strength rather than fear. Maya's growing reputation as an advocate led to an unexpected opportunity. A documentary filmmaker named Robert Chen was creating a film about innovative approaches to domestic violence intervention and had heard about Maya's story through the network of service providers. He was particularly interested in the role that James and traditional indigenous knowledge had played in her rescue and recovery, seeing it as an example of how communities could support survivors in ways that went beyond conventional social services. Initially, Maya was hesitant about participating in the documentary. She had become comfortable sharing her story in professional settings and advocacy contexts, but the idea of having her experience broadcast to a wider audience felt overwhelming. She worried about her privacy, about Derek potentially seeing the film, and about whether her story would be exploited rather than used constructively. James encouraged Maya to consider the filmmaker's request, pointing out that her story might reach women in rural or isolated areas who had never heard of resources like safe houses or victim advocates. He also offered to participate in the documentary himself, sharing his perspectives on the intersection between traditional indigenous practices and modern social work approaches. His willingness to be involved helped Maya feel more confident about the project. After several conversations with Robert and his production team, Maya agreed to participate with certain conditions. She would maintain control over how her story was told. Derek's identity would be protected, and a portion of any profits from the film would be donated to domestic violence service organizations. Most importantly, the film would include practical information about resources available to survivors, essentially functioning as both storytelling and public education. The filming process took several months and involved returning to many of the locations that had been significant in Maya's journey. Standing at the edge of the desert where James had found her, Maya was struck by how different she felt from the terrified woman who had fled into the wilderness 2 years earlier. The landscape that had once seemed like a potential grave now felt like a place of transformation and renewal. James proved to be a natural on camera, explaining traditional tracking techniques and desert survival skills, while also discussing the cultural values that had motivated him to help Maya. His portions of the documentary provided viewers with insights into indigenous approaches to community responsibility and healing that were rarely seen in mainstream media. He spoke about the desert as a teacher rather than an adversary, and about the importance of helping others without expecting recognition or reward. The filmmaker also interviewed Alina and several other women who had stayed at the safe house, creating a comprehensive picture of the support systems that enable survivors to rebuild their lives. Maya was particularly moved by the interviews with women she had met during her own stay, seeing how they had continued their own healing journeys and were now helping other survivors in various capacities. When the documentary was completed, Maya watched it with a mixture of pride and amazement, hardly recognizing herself in the confident advocate on screen. The documentary premiered at several film festivals and eventually aired on a major cable network, reaching millions of viewers across the country. Maya was overwhelmed by the response. Hundreds of emails from survivors sharing their own stories, from family members seeking advice about how to help loved ones in abusive relationships, and from service providers wanting to learn more about innovative intervention approaches. Among the most meaningful responses were messages from women in rural and isolated areas who had never realized that help was available to them. Several wrote that Maya's story had given them hope and practical information about safety planning and resource access. One woman in rural Montana wrote that the film had inspired her to leave her abusive husband and seek help at a domestic violence shelter 300 miles away from her home. The documentary also sparked academic and policy interest in the role that traditional indigenous knowledge could play in modern social work practice. James was invited to speak at several universities and professional conferences, sharing his perspectives on community-based intervention and the cultural values that supported his decision to help Maya. His presentations challenged audiences to think more broadly about who could serve as helpers and healers in their communities. Maya found herself in demand as a speaker and consultant, traveling throughout the Southwest to train service providers, law enforcement officers, and community groups about domestic violence dynamics and survivor-centered approaches to intervention. She particularly enjoyed working with rural communities, where resources were often limited, but community connections could be leveraged to support survivors in creative ways. One of Maya's most impactful presentations was to a group of tribal social workers who were developing culturally appropriate domestic violence services for their communities. She spoke about the healing power of traditional knowledge and the importance of approaching survivors with patience and respect for their autonomy. Many of the participants shared their own stories of incorporating traditional practices into their professional work. The success of the documentary also led to book deal offers, but Maya was selective about the opportunities she pursued. She eventually collaborated with a writer who specialized in social justice issues to create a book that combined her personal story with practical information about domestic violence prevention and intervention. The book included contributions from James about traditional survival skills, and from Elena about the therapeutic approaches used at the safe house. Maya insisted that a significant portion of the book's proceeds be used to establish a scholarship fund for survivors of domestic violence who wanted to pursue education or job training. She remembered how important financial independence had been to her own recovery and wanted to help other women achieve economic stability that would protect them from future abuse. 3 years after her rescue, Maya had become a recognized expert in her field, but she never forgot the vulnerability and terror that had driven her into the desert that July morning. Maya's advocacy work eventually led her to establish her own nonprofit organization focused on serving domestic violence survivors in rural and Native American communities. The organization, which she named Desert Strength, combined traditional social services with innovative approaches inspired by her own rescue experience. The program included wilderness therapy components, traditional healing practices, and partnerships with indigenous community members who could provide cultural knowledge and support. James became Desert Strength's first board member and program consultant, helping to develop protocols for incorporating traditional indigenous practices into trauma recovery work. His expertise in tracking and desert survival was adapted into therapeutic activities that helped survivors rebuild confidence and self-reliance. The organization also employed several other Native American staff members who brought diverse tribal perspectives and cultural knowledge to their work. One of Desert Strength's most successful programs paired newly arrived survivors with women who had completed their own healing journeys, creating mentor relationships that provided both practical support and emotional encouragement. Maya had learned from her own experience how important it was to see examples of other women who had successfully rebuilt their lives after abuse. The organization also developed mobile outreach services to reach women in extremely isolated areas, using all-terrain vehicles and satellite communication equipment to provide services in locations where traditional domestic violence agencies couldn't operate effectively. These mobile units were staffed by advocates who had received specialized training in wilderness safety and cultural competency. Elena eventually joined Desert Strength as clinical director, bringing her expertise in trauma therapy and residential treatment programs. Together, she and Maya created a continuum of services that could meet survivors' needs from crisis intervention through long-term recovery and empowerment. The collaboration between their different skill sets and approaches created a model that other organizations began studying and replicating. Desert Strength's reputation grew throughout the Southwest, and Maya found herself consulting with tribal governments, state agencies, and federal programs about effective approaches to domestic violence intervention in rural communities. She testified before Congress about the unique challenges faced by survivors in isolated areas and advocated for increased funding for culturally appropriate services. Despite her growing professional responsibilities, Maya maintained her direct service work, spending several hours each week providing individual advocacy and support to new survivors. She found that this hands-on work kept her grounded and reminded her why her organization's mission was so important. Each woman she helped represented not just an individual success story, but a victory over the systems and attitudes that enabled domestic violence to flourish. Maya's personal life had also stabilized and flourished during this period, though she remained cautious about romantic relationships and focused primarily on her friendships, professional relationships, and advocacy work. 5 years after her desert rescue, Maya received news that would test everything she had learned about healing and forgiveness. Derek had been released from prison after serving his sentence and completing required treatment programs. His parole officer contacted Desert Strength as part of his reintegration planning, not knowing about Maya's personal connection to the case, but following standard protocols for notifying domestic violence service providers about releases in their area. Maya's initial reaction was panic, the same fight-or-flight response that had driven her into the desert years earlier. Despite all her therapy, advocacy work, and personal growth, learning that Derek was free and living in Arizona again triggered deep-seated fears that she thought she had overcome. She found herself checking locks obsessively, varying her daily routines, and experiencing nightmares for the first time in years. James and Alina both offered additional support during this difficult period, reminding Maya that her reaction was normal and that healing wasn't linear. They helped her develop practical safety strategies while also addressing the emotional impact of Derek's release. Maya took temporary leave from some of her public speaking engagements and increased her sessions with her own therapist. Working through her fear and anxiety took several months, but the process ultimately strengthened Maya's understanding of trauma recovery and informed her work with other survivors. She realized that even years after escaping an abusive relationship, survivors might face unexpected triggers and challenges that required renewed attention and support. This insight led her to develop follow-up services for women who had completed Desert Strength's initial programs. Maya also had to confront her feelings about Derek's attempts at rehabilitation. The treatment programs he had completed in prison were based on research about changing abusive behavior, and his parole plan included ongoing counseling and monitoring. Maya struggled with wanting to believe that people could change while also protecting herself and other potential victims from someone who had caused serious harm. Eventually, Maya decided to channel her concerns about Derek's release into broader advocacy work, focused on improving offender treatment programs and post-release monitoring systems. She began working with criminal justice professionals to develop better protocols for protecting survivors when their abusers were released from prison, including improved notification systems and safety planning resources. Maya's experience with Derek's release also motivated her to expand Desert Strength's legal advocacy services, helping survivors navigate protective order processes and victim rights issues. She hired an attorney who specialized in domestic violence law to provide legal consultations and represent clients in court proceedings when necessary. Through all of these challenges, Maya maintained her commitment to helping other survivors while also taking care of her own ongoing needs for safety and healing. Maya's work with Desert Strength eventually caught the attention of federal policymakers who were developing new initiatives to address domestic violence in rural and tribal communities. She was invited to serve on a national advisory committee that would make recommendations about resource allocation and program development priorities. The opportunity represented validation of her expertise and a chance to influence policy at the highest levels. Preparing for her role on the advisory committee required Maya to research domestic violence programs throughout the country, analyzing what worked well and identifying gaps in services. She traveled extensively, visiting innovative programs and interviewing survivors, advocates, and researchers. The process deepened her understanding of how factors like geography, culture, economics, and politics all influenced communities' responses to domestic violence. One of Maya's most significant contributions to the advisory committee was her advocacy for incorporating traditional healing practices and indigenous knowledge into federally funded programs. She argued that communities had resources and wisdom that weren't being utilized by conventional social service approaches, and that cultural competency required more than just translating materials into different languages. James accompanied Maya to several committee meetings, presenting information about traditional indigenous approaches to conflict resolution and community healing. His presentations were well received by committee members who were looking for innovative solutions to persistent problems. Several committee members noted that his approach offered alternatives to purely punitive responses to domestic violence that might be more effective in certain cultural contexts. The advisory committee's final recommendations included increased funding for rural domestic violence services, support for culturally specific programs, and pilot projects that would test innovative intervention approaches. Maya was particularly pleased that the recommendations emphasized survivor leadership and community-based solutions rather than top-down programming designed by people without direct experience of domestic violence. Maya's service on the advisory committee also connected her with advocates and researchers from around the world who were working on similar issues. She began collaborating with international organizations on projects related to domestic violence in rural and indigenous communities, sharing strategies and learning from approaches used in other countries. These international connections led to speaking opportunities at conferences in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, where Maya presented about Desert Strength's programs and the role that traditional knowledge had played in her own survival and recovery. She was particularly interested in learning from Aboriginal and Maori advocates who had developed culturally grounded approaches to addressing family violence in their communities. Maya's growing international profile also attracted media attention, with several magazines and news programs featuring her story and Desert Strength's work. She used these platforms to educate the public about domestic violence dynamics and to advocate for increased support for survivors, particularly those in underserved communities. 7 years after her rescue, Maya faced a personal milestone that brought her journey full circle. She had been invited to speak at a conference on trauma recovery that was being held in Phoenix, the city she had fled in terror so many years earlier. The invitation represented not just professional recognition, but an opportunity to confront the geographical site of her trauma from a position of strength and expertise. Maya decided to accept the speaking engagement, but she also planned to use the trip to visit some of the places that had been significant during her relationship with Derek. She wanted to reclaim her connection to Phoenix and prove to herself that she could walk through the city without being overwhelmed by fear or painful memories. James offered to accompany her on this personal pilgrimage, understanding the emotional significance of her return. The night before her presentation, Maya and James drove to the neighborhood where she had lived with Derek. The apartment building looked smaller and shabbier than she remembered, and she felt a mixture of sadness and relief as she looked up at the windows of her former home. A young woman was hanging laundry on the balcony that had once been hers, and Maya silently wished her safety and happiness. Maya's conference presentation focused on the role that community connections and traditional knowledge had played in her recovery, emphasizing how healing happened through relationships rather than just individual therapy or formal services. She spoke about the importance of approaching survivors as experts on their own experiences and needs, rather than as passive recipients of professional services. The audience response to Maya's presentation was enthusiastic, with many participants approaching her afterward to share their own stories or to ask for advice about incorporating similar approaches into their work. Several survivors in the audience thanked her for showing them that it was possible to not just survive domestic violence, but to thrive and help others in the process. During the conference, Maya also met Dr. Patricia Williams, a researcher who was studying long-term outcomes for domestic violence survivors. Dr. Williams was interested in Maya's story because it represented successful recovery despite multiple risk factors that often predicted poor outcomes: severe abuse, social isolation, limited resources, and trauma exposure. Their conversation sparked ideas for collaborative research that could identify factors that promoted resilience and recovery. Maya's return to Phoenix also included a visit to the grocery store where she had worked during her relationship with Derek. She was surprised to find that several of her former coworkers still worked there, and they were amazed by her transformation. The store manager, who had been concerned about Maya's frequent absences and visible injuries years earlier, told her how proud he was of what she had accomplished. The trip to Phoenix confirmed for Maya that she had truly healed from the trauma of her relationship with Derek and had built a life that was not defined by fear or limitations imposed by others. Maya's collaboration with Dr. Patricia Williams evolved into a comprehensive research study examining factors that contributed to successful long-term recovery from domestic violence. The study followed survivors for multiple years after leaving abusive relationships, tracking their outcomes in areas like mental health, economic stability, relationship satisfaction, and community engagement. Maya served as both a research participant and a consultant, helping to develop culturally sensitive research methods and survivor-centered outcome measures. The preliminary findings from the study supported many of Maya's observations about what helped survivors thrive rather than just survive. Factors like community connection, meaningful work, opportunities to help others, and access to culturally appropriate services all correlated with positive long-term outcomes. Surprisingly, some factors that service providers emphasized, like immediate housing stability or rapid economic independence, were less predictive of long-term well-being than relationships and purpose. Maya used these research findings to refine Desert Strength's programs, placing even greater emphasis on peer support, volunteer opportunities, and community engagement activities. She also began training other domestic violence organizations about the importance of addressing survivors' needs for meaning and connection, not just safety and basic services. The research collaboration also led to additional funding opportunities for Desert Strength, as foundations and government agencies became interested in supporting evidence-based programs that demonstrated measurable outcomes. Maya was able to expand the organization's services to include job training programs, educational scholarships, and small business development assistance for survivors who wanted to achieve economic independence. One of Desert Strength's most successful new programs was a social enterprise that employed survivors in making traditional crafts and artwork that were sold online and at cultural events. The program provided both income and therapeutic benefits, as participants learned traditional skills while also developing business and marketing abilities. James served as a cultural consultant for the program, teaching participants about the spiritual and historical significance of the crafts they were creating. Maya also expanded Desert Strength's prevention and education work, developing programs for schools, workplaces, and community organizations about recognizing and responding to domestic violence. She trained participants to identify warning signs, provide appropriate support to disclosure recipients, and connect survivors with professional resources. These prevention programs reached thousands of people throughout Arizona and neighboring states. Maya's expertise in program development and evaluation led to consulting opportunities with organizations throughout North America. She helped domestic violence agencies in rural areas develop culturally appropriate services, trained staff at Native American health centers about trauma-informed care, and advised government agencies about policy changes that would better support survivors. Despite her demanding professional schedule, Maya maintained her commitment to direct service work, spending time each week providing individual support to survivors and their families. A decade after her desert rescue, Maya received an honor that would have seemed impossible during her darkest days with Derek. She was selected to receive a MacArthur Fellowship, often called a Genius Grant, in recognition of her innovative work developing community-based responses to domestic violence. The fellowship provided financial support for her continued work and national recognition of her contributions to the field. The MacArthur announcement brought media attention from around the world, with journalists wanting to understand how a woman who had fled into the desert to escape an abusive relationship had become a nationally recognized expert and advocate. Maya used the media opportunities to educate the public about domestic violence dynamics and to advocate for increased support for survivors, particularly those in rural and indigenous communities. Maya's acceptance speech for the MacArthur Fellowship focused on the network of people and communities that had made her work possible. She spoke about James as her first teacher in survival and community responsibility, about Elena as a model of professional excellence and personal compassion, and about the many survivors who had shared their stories and strategies with her over the years. The fellowship also provided Maya with resources to establish an endowment fund that would ensure Desert Strength's long-term sustainability. She worked with financial advisors to create a funding structure that would support the organization's core services in perpetuity, freeing her to focus on program innovation and expansion rather than constant fundraising. Maya used her MacArthur recognition to launch a national initiative focused on developing indigenous-led responses to domestic violence in tribal communities. The initiative provided technical assistance, training, and funding to tribal organizations that wanted to develop culturally grounded intervention and prevention programs. James served as a senior consultant for the initiative, training other indigenous community members about traditional healing practices and community responsibility approaches. The initiative's first year included pilot projects in 12 tribal communities across the United States and Canada, each developing unique approaches that reflected their specific cultural traditions and community needs. Maya traveled extensively to visit these pilot sites, learning from indigenous advocates who were adapting traditional practices to address contemporary domestic violence challenges. One of the most successful pilot projects was developed by a Navajo Nation program that combined traditional healing ceremonies with modern safety planning and counseling services. The program's success led to increased funding from both tribal and federal sources, and its model was adapted by other tribal communities throughout the Southwest.